If you remove every tomato sucker the moment you see it, then there's a good chance you're throwing away part of your harvest without even knowing it. I made that mistake myself for years because everyone kept saying the same thing, and I followed the advice without asking why. Every week I walked through my garden with a pair of pruners cutting every little shoot I could find, and I believed I was helping my plants. The tomatoes looked neat and tidy, but when harvest came, I always felt something was missing. The plants worked hard all summer, yet the baskets never filled the way I expected, and I kept blaming the weather or the soil. Then one older gardener watched me for a few minutes and smiled before saying that I was making the same mistake most people make because I was treating every tomato plant exactly the same. That simple sentence stayed with me. From that day on, I stopped rushing with the pruning and started paying attention to what each plant was actually trying to tell me. What I discovered completely changed the way I grow tomatoes, and ever since then my plants have been healthier, my fruit has been larger, and my harvest has lasted much longer without spending another dollar on special products. The funny thing is that this old method is not complicated at all, and it takes less time than constantly cutting every new shoot you see. Most gardeners think removing suckers is just about making the plant look cleaner, but the real reason has much more to do with how the plant shares its strength. Once you understand that, you stop fighting the plant and start working with it instead. In this video, I want to show you exactly how I decide which suckers stay and which ones go, because there is a very important difference that many people never notice. I will explain the timing, the small signs I watch for every morning, and the one place where I almost never remove a sucker anymore. That single habit has saved more tomato clusters than I can count. And before we get to that part, there is one mistake almost everyone makes during the very first weeks after transplanting that quietly reduces the harvest long before the first flowers even appear. The first weeks after transplanting are when most of the damage is done, and the strange part is that you usually cannot see it until much later. I used to think the real work started when the plants became tall enough to tie to the stakes, but I learned that the first small suckers are already deciding how the season will end. Many people either remove every sucker as soon as it appears, or they leave every one of them because they feel sorry for cutting healthy growth. I have done both, and neither gave me the harvest I wanted. A tomato plant is like a careful saver. It has only so much energy each day, and it quietly decides where to send it. When too many stems are growing at the same time, the plant spreads its strength in every direction. You end up with lots of leaves, lots of thin branches, and many flowers that never become the large tomatoes you hoped for. On the other hand, if you strip the plant too hard too early, it loses many healthy leaves that protect the fruit from strong summer sun and help feed the whole plant. That is why I stopped following simple rules that say always remove every sucker or never remove them. Instead, I started watching the balance of the plant. An older gardener showed me this many years ago, and he said something I never forgot. He told me that the plant already knows how to grow, and my job is only to guide it instead of controlling every little branch. That sounded almost too simple, but after trying it for several seasons, I saw the difference with my own eyes. The plants stayed open enough for fresh air to move through them, which helped keep the leaves dry after rain and morning dew, while still keeping enough green growth to protect the fruit and feed the roots. Very few people pay attention to that balance because they are too busy looking for one rule that works everywhere. Tomatoes do not all grow the same way, and once you accept that, the whole job becomes much easier. Before you even touch the first sucker, there is one question I always ask myself, and the answer decides whether I leave that shoot alone or remove it without hesitation, because one wrong cut at the wrong place can quietly reduce the harvest weeks before you ever notice it. The question I ask is very simple. What kind of tomato am I growing? That changed everything for me because I finally understood that not every tomato should be treated the same way. If I am growing a determinate variety that naturally reaches a certain size and then focuses on producing fruit, I leave most of the suckers alone because every healthy branch can carry another cluster of tomatoes. If I start removing too many of them, I am actually throwing away fruit before it even has a chance to grow. But when I grow an indeterminate tomato that keeps climbing and producing all season, I become much more careful. Those plants can keep making new stems forever, and if I let every sucker grow, they quickly become a thick wall of leaves where sunlight can barely reach and fresh air struggles to move through. That is where disease often begins, and where small green tomatoes stay hidden instead of growing well. Years ago, an older gardener showed me something that looked almost too easy to matter. He never rushed through the garden with his pruners. Instead, he stood in front of each plant for a few seconds and simply looked at its shape. He asked himself where the sunlight would fall during the afternoon and whether he could still see through the middle of the plant. If the answer was no, then he removed only the sucker that was creating too much crowding. If the plant still looked open and balanced, he walked away without cutting anything. Very few people have that patience because they think gardening is about doing more work, but many times the better harvest comes from making fewer cuts instead of more. I began using that same approach and I noticed something surprising. The plants stayed healthier through the hottest part of summer and I spent less time fighting yellow leaves and damaged fruit. The tomatoes ripened more evenly because the plant was putting its energy where it really mattered instead of feeding too many unnecessary stems. But there is one sucker that almost everyone removes without thinking, and it is often the one I leave in place for a very practical reason, because if the main stem is ever damaged by wind-heavy fruit, or an accident, that single shoot can quietly save the entire plant, and most gardeners never realize its value until it is already gone. One of the best habits I ever learned was to stop thinking that every sucker is a problem waiting to be removed. Instead, I started looking for the one that could become my backup plan. I almost always leave one strong sucker growing just below the first flower cluster on healthy, indeterminate tomatoes. I learned this many years ago from a man who had been growing tomatoes longer than I had been alive. He told me that storms do not ask for permission, and accidents happen when you least expect them. A heavy branch can snap. Strong wind can break the main stem. Even while tying the plant to a support, you can make one careless move and damage the leader. Before I followed his advice, those accidents usually meant the plant would spend weeks recovering, and my harvest would become much smaller. After I began leaving that one carefully chosen sucker, everything changed. If the main stem stayed healthy, I could always remove the backup later if I felt the plant was becoming too crowded. But if something happened to the main stem, I already had another strong shoot ready to take over without slowing the plant down very much. That simple habit costs nothing and takes only a few seconds, yet it has saved more harvests than any expensive fertilizer I have ever bought. Most people never think that far ahead because they only see what the plant looks like today instead of what it may look like a month from now. Another mistake I often see is waiting until the suckers become thick and woody before removing them. At that stage, the plant has already spent a great deal of energy growing them, and cutting them away leaves a much larger wound. I prefer checking my tomatoes every few days while the suckers are still small and easy to pinch off with my fingers. The plant barely notices the difference and the wound heals much faster. I also never rush through the whole garden in one afternoon. I move slowly from plant to plant because every tomato is growing at its own pace. Some need a little attention while others need none at all. That quiet walk through the garden often shows me other small problems before they become serious. I notice a loose tie, a damaged leaf, or the first sign of insects while they are still easy to deal with. But there is another place where many gardeners remove healthy growth without realizing they are exposing their tomatoes to a completely different problem that can ruin beautiful fruit, even when the plant looks perfectly healthy. For a long time, I believed the more leaves I removed, the healthier my tomatoes would become, because everyone talked about improving airflow and preventing disease. There is some truth in that, but I eventually learned that too much pruning creates a different problem that many gardeners never connect to their own hands. Those large, healthy leaves are not just taking up space. They are quietly protecting the fruit every hot afternoon. I remember one summer when I removed far too many leaves because the plants looked crowded. A week later, the weather turned extremely hot and bright. At first, everything seemed fine, But then I noticed pale patches appearing on tomatoes that had looked perfect only days before. Those fruits had been exposed to direct afternoon sun without the natural shade the leaves had been giving them. They continued to ripen, but the damaged areas never recovered and many tomatoes were no longer worth keeping. That was a lesson I never forgot. Since then, I remove only the leaves that truly need to go. If a leaf is touching the soil, I remove it because it can collect moisture and dirt. If it is yellowing badly or clearly diseased, I remove it right away. If it is growing deep inside the plant where no light reaches and no air can move, I may take it off as well. But healthy leaves that are protecting developing fruit usually stay where they are. Most people think they are helping the plant by making it look cleaner, but the tomato does not care how tidy it looks. It only cares about making enough energy to fill every fruit and protecting those fruits from stress. Another small habit that has helped me for years is never removing too many leaves or suckers on the same day. I prefer making a few careful cuts each time I walk through the garden and then letting the plant recover before doing more. The plant hardly notices those small adjustments and continues growing without slowing down. That slow approach also gives me time to notice how each tomato responds, because no two plants behave exactly alike, even when they are growing side by side. Very few gardeners have the patience to do this, but the difference becomes obvious by the middle of summer. There is still one final habit that ties everything together, and once I started using it, my tomato plants became easier to manage, and my harvest stayed strong right until the end of the season. By this point in the season, I am no longer thinking about how many suckers I removed or how perfectly the plants are shaped. What I pay attention to now is how the plants respond to every small decision I made weeks earlier. Healthy tomato plants tell their own story if you take a few quiet minutes to watch them. The leaves stay a rich green. The flower clusters keep appearing. The fruit grows evenly without the plant looking tired or stressed. That is when I know I've found the right balance. I do not chase perfection anymore because I learned that tomatoes are much more forgiving than people think when you stop interfering with every new shoot they produce. One habit that has helped me more than almost anything else is walking through the garden early in the morning with nothing in my hands. No pruners, no bucket, no fertilizer. I simply look at each plant for a moment. I notice which stems are carrying heavy fruit. I see where a tie may need to be loosened before it cuts into the stem. I look for a small sucker that can wait until my next visit instead of removing it immediately. Those few quiet minutes often save me much more work later. Many gardeners believe they need to do something every time they enter the garden, but sometimes the smartest decision is to leave a healthy plant alone. An older gardener once told me that every unnecessary cut asks the plant to spend energy healing instead of growing tomatoes. I have remembered those words every season since then. That does not mean ignoring problems. If I see a damaged branch or a diseased leaf, I deal with it quickly. If I find a sucker creating heavy crowding inside the plant, I remove it while it is still small. But I never prune just because it is Saturday or because the calendar tells me it is time. I let the plant guide me instead. That simple change made gardening feel calmer and much more enjoyable. I spend less money because I do not need expensive products to fix problems caused by over-pruning. I harvest more tomatoes because the plants keep their strength where it belongs. Best of all, I no longer worry every time I see a new sucker growing because I understand that each one deserves a quick look before I decide its future. And there is one final lesson that brought all of these small habits together and completely changed the way I think about growing tomatoes from the first warm days of spring until the very last harvest of the season. The biggest lesson I have learned after all these years is that growing more tomatoes is not about making the plant obey you, about understanding what the plant is trying to do and helping it instead of getting in its way. Once I stopped removing every sucker without thinking and began making small, careful decisions, the entire season became easier. I spent less time fixing problems because I created fewer of them in the first place. My plants stayed stronger during hot weather. They continued setting fruit for much longer, and the tomatoes themselves were larger and more consistent. None of that required expensive fertilizers, fancy tools, or complicated techniques. It only required slowing down and paying attention. That is probably why this old method has survived for so many years. It costs nothing, yet it continues to reward anyone willing to practice a little patience. If you remember only a few things from this conversation, let them be these. Learn whether your tomato is determinate or indeterminate before you make the first cut. Never rush to remove every sucker, because some of them may become your greatest help later in the season. Remove small suckers while they are still easy to pinch, instead of waiting until they become thick branches. Keep enough healthy leaves to protect the fruit from strong afternoon sun. Let every plant show you what it needs instead of treating the whole garden exactly the same. These simple habits have given me more good harvests than any bottle or bag I have ever bought. Every summer I still learn something new because every season is a little different. That is one of the reasons I never get tired of growing tomatoes. The garden always rewards careful observation and quiet patience. If this season you make only one change, I hope it is that you stop looking at suckers as little enemies and start seeing them as signals that help you understand your plant. Once you begin looking at tomatoes this way, you may be surprised how much easier the whole process becomes and how much more confident you feel every time you walk through your garden. I truly believe anyone can grow healthier tomato plants without spending more money simply by making better decisions one small step at a time. And after you see the difference for yourself, there is another old gardening habit that almost disappeared over the years, but has helped me produce even stronger tomato plants. And that is a story I look forward to sharing with you next time.